Welcome and thank you for joining me as I have the privilege today of interviewing Governor Dick Thornburgh as part of the Penn State Homeland Security Distinguished Speaker Series. I am Alexander Siedschlag, Professor of Homeland Security at Penn State Harrisburg and Chair of Penn State Homeland Security Graduate Programs. Governor Thornburgh is joining me today here at Penn State Harrisburg campus during our conference on TMI at 35, the 3 Mile Island Nuclear Crisis in Perspective, Analysis, Stories, Policies. In fact, tomorrow, the 28th of March 2014, is the 35th anniversary of the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant accident that occurred in Middletown. That's 10 miles off Harrisburg, and Middletown is also where the campus of Penn State Harrisburg is located and where we meet today. Dick Thornburgh had just been sworn in as the governor of Pennsylvania in Harrisburg, some 2 months before the accident. The 3 Mile Island, or TMI, accident of 1979 led to a partial core meltdown. As Governor Thornburgh pointed out in his own writings, a meltdown does not involve the risk of a nuclear power plant going off like an atomic bomb in a big mushroom, but it does involve the risk of contaminated matter penetrating the concrete bases of the reactor building, contaminating soil and water for tens, if not hundreds of years. Additionally, in the TMI accident, there were concerns about radioactive steam being released into the atmosphere and the perceived risk of a hydrogen bubble in the reactor building that some experts said could actually explode and set free more radioactivity into the atmosphere. While Homeland Security today happens in the context of an all-hazards approach, that, among other things, still includes emergency management to a large extent. Some may, however, still wonder why TMI is a subject of interest in Homeland Security. A practical answer why TMI is a subject of interest in Homeland Security can be found in the Governor's Guide to Homeland Security, which the National Governors Association released a couple of years ago. That guide heavily focuses on the all-hazard approach and on comprehensive incident response, regardless of the character and source of the incident. This is an important part of the Homeland Security enterprise and its joint responsibility to deliver security to citizens and foster a resilient nation. In fact, the Governor's Guide to Homeland Security starts with a section on the challenge of Homeland Security governance, citing the multiple challenges that Governor Thornburgh was facing during the 3 Mile Island nuclear crisis of 1979, long before the term of Homeland Security was invented. Quotation: "Just 71 days into his term, Governor Thornburgh found himself in the national spotlight and was expected to serve expertly as the leader in a litany of complicated duties: Commander-in-Chief of the state forces responding to the incident, Chief Executive Officer of the government, Chief Communicator to a worried public, and Chief of Liaison to the governors of neighboring states and to the federal government." Mr. Governor, welcome to Penn State Harrisburg. Thank you for being with us for the TMI at 35 event, and thank you for graciously giving of your time for this interview.
Not at all. Pleased to be here.
Thank you, sir. In your autobiography, you write you learned about the 3 Mile Island accident through a phone call you received from the State Director of Emergency Management in the morning of the day of the accident, the 28th of March 1979. Where were you at that time, and what was your first very emotional reaction to the news, and then what were your first rational thoughts on it?
I was at the governor's residence for a scheduled breakfast with Democratic freshman legislators, opposite party legislators, trying to develop some support for my brand new budget that I'd presented. I'd only been in office for 72 days, but I was focused like a laser beam on this message to the freshman legislators when I got news that I had a call from our Director of Emergency Management. And taking that phone call, I learned that we had had a nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island, and that we had seen our carefully arranged agenda for promoting the budget destroyed at one fell swoop. My initial reaction, of course, was to try to get as clear a picture as I could of what actually had transpired at the site. And we were able to put that together by bits and pieces, but it was a challenge because there were so many people who were misinformed or ill-informed about what had happened, who were eager to share their views, but they were of no help whatsoever in dealing with the problem. And I must admit to feeling a little bit helpless from time to time, having all of this machinery of government, state government at my fingertips, but not being quite confident enough to lay out a plan of action to follow something that had, after all, never happened on the face of the earth before.
Talking about government, as you describe in your autobiography as well, and also in other of your publications, your managerial response to the crisis from its very start was a trusted autocracy. That is, as you define it, sir, a team of close associates whose judgment and competence you trusted. Was that a deliberate crisis management strategy of yours to set up such a structure, or did it just start to emerge and you went on with it?
I think it evolved. The one characteristic that made the selection and use of that group absolutely necessary was the fact we'd been in office for so short a period of time. I had had no opportunity to get to know on a personal basis the leaders within the various segments of state government. I didn't know exactly who I could trust. I knew that there were some political enemies who were embedded in there that I wasn't going to rely on, but that logically drove me to what ended up we called the adhocracy, people drawn from throughout state government because of their skill and because of their personal relationship with me and the fact that we trusted one another. Mercifully, that didn't happen throughout the entire 8 years I was in office. We developed some splendid public servants among the people who we worked with. But at that time, there was a very small group of people who I was willing to trust with matters of great importance.
Crisis response also involved President Carter himself, who visited TMI on the 1st of April 1979. And this visit, in fact, has by research often been interpreted as so-called crisis termination. Mm-hmm. When it was safe for the president to go there, this means that the danger was in fact averted. How did you hear about the president's plan for a visit, and what were your first thoughts on it?
Well, we had excellent relations with the White House, even though I was a Republican and President Carter was a Democrat. Still are, both of us, I guess. But we knew that when a colossal challenge such as a nuclear accident occurs, you got to throw the politics out the window. The people who elected us, or whether they're Democrats or Republicans, want the problem solved. And I was pleased that he shared that view, and I never saw any evidence, except on a very limited basis, of somebody trying to make political capital out of one thing or another. And I've always been grateful to President Carter, whose presidency was not among our greatest, but in this particular instance, he could not have been more faithful to the best interests of the people of Pennsylvania.
Talking about people and the younger generation, TMI not only stands for 3 Mile Island. To many of the younger people, it denotes too much information.
Yes, exactly.
Classical sociology of disaster speaks much about reflective fear. That is too much information that creates irrational or at least disproportionately high citizen anxiety. Your modus operandi was to keep to business as usual at the governor's office, or at least give the impression thereof, as you write in your autobiography. So looking back on this from today, would your approach to crisis management and communication be still similar or considerably different? And if so, why?
Well, if I were answering that today, today's technology provides the answer. As I noted in my remarks today, we had no cell phones, we had no Blackberries, we had no capability to have group meetings. We were just totally, by today's standards, totally lacking in the basics of the ability to communicate. We're using landlines, telephones. That's what we used for most of the time. Or occasionally one of the military services would give us some kind of communication capability. But it would be entirely different today. So it's hard to say one era versus the other than the fact to say that it would be so different.
Communication also has a lot to do with evacuation and communicating behavioral recommendations to citizens. And disaster research, in fact, has typically addressed evacuation mainly as a communication issue. Early on, you considered it as a choice of the lesser evil, whether to evacuate or not evacuate, while, as you write in your autobiography, the thought of issuing a general evacuation order entered your mind immediately and never left you in the days to follow. At the same time, you mentioned you were apprehensive about the risks involved in moving a population the size of 200,000 people with potential for panic, injury, and even loss of life. So what is your advice to today's experts and practitioners facing the challenge of ethical decision-making in emergency response?
Well, I think the point that has always, to me, been essential in understanding decision-making of any kind is the absolute necessity of an assurance that the facts that you are operating on are the true facts of the situation. You got so many versions of what was going on. I mean, we had people spreading wild stories about birth abnormalities in animals, about destruction of plant material. I mean, all these things, none of them had any basis in fact. They had an enormous potential to cause great fear among the populace. And that's when I get back to my discussion about my reluctance to willy-nilly suggest an evacuation. What you always have to have in the back of your mind when you're making those kinds of decisions is, how is this going to affect my neighbor? I mean, here I'm ordering an evacuation of 200,000 people. Is my neighbor in the final analysis going to credit me for that, or is he going to regard me as some kind of incompetent? So that kind of pressure, I think, is part of what our democracy provides us, and I think it's a good thing to not be too sure of a fixed and immutable course of action. You've got to be able to respond to the situation as it develops, as you learn more facts, different facts, new advisors. The whole process is a dynamic one, and one that you really, it's hard to pin down with specifics.
What have you never been asked about your role in 3 Mile Island crisis management?
I doubt if there's anything out there after 35 years that hasn't been put to me in one form or another. But I've had whole families within my family grow maturity during that period of time. So it's kind of hard to pin down anything.
Would you have wished something to be asked during your actual championship of the crisis?
I saw that question and I thought, I just didn't have time. I didn't have time to fashion an agenda that we wanted to impose on the facts. And that was a really kind of healthy thing, because I was relentless in my cross-examination of people who came to give us information about what was going on there, what we should be doing in that, because I knew that there was so much involved in terms of that hypothetical neighbor of mine.
Finally, sir, if you could change one thing about the reaction to and the overall handling of the accident, what would that be and why?
I think I'd want to make sure nowadays that in responding to any emergency of the type that 3 Mile Island incident triggered, that we were making maximum use of the incredible communication technologies that have sprung up in the 35 years since the accident. I mean, we had no cell phones, we had no capability to communicate other than over the landlines of the phone company. There were no tweets or Twitters, and no. It was a really a basic communications environment within which we operated. And every time I look at a particular segment of our experience during that, I can't help but think, if we'd only had a cell phone, or that, if we'd only had the ability to fax materials or stuff like that. It was really quite a revelation when you stop down. Somebody's done this. Somebody's written a book about the way we've developed these capabilities and how they affect our everyday life. But most of it's beyond me. But I know that it's important to use it.
Mr. Governor, once again, thank you so much for coming to Penn State Harrisburg, and thank you for the interview.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.